Hello everyone, today we talk about working women of the low Middle Ages. So this is my first gender history video on my channel, and I think it will be, the first of a rather short series because I fear I'm not the most qualified person to talk about it, as I haven't really studied this topic very much. I just know certain things about medieval society. It happened to me to actually come across the juridical status of women throughout several, societies, the Middle Ages, but I don't have this thorough, comprehensive knowledge and not even comprehension at a certain point of the subject, as it really involves a lot of studying of juridical studies most of all. In fact, this is going to be a video about, in fact, the low Middle Ages, and more specifically, it's conceived to give a look a bit at the communal world in the first place, and the surrounding, let's say, countryside. But telling the truth, that some of the most interesting things I've read about women's history were for the early Middle Ages. As a matter of fact, I think I will make sooner or later a video about, for instance, Longobarд women, something that was very interesting for me, and more generally, I'm keen on framing this, actually, say, gender history into a broader perspective, the evolution of society as a whole. So that's why I'm not really an expert of gender history, because I never got thoroughly interested into that specifically. I think when I was at university, I had only one exam about gender history, but it was something, if I remember correctly, about 15th century Rome. So besides something very late to the period I really study also by myself, it was a pretty, it was actually an interesting class. But it looked at the Roman society as a whole a little bit, so it wasn't even specifically about women's history. There is a book, though, that I had to study for, I think, my very first exam of modern history. That is M.A. Wisner's The Women of Modern Europe, 1500-1750. That was a very beautiful book to read, and it said a lot of interesting things, because although being focused on modern history, it really took into consideration a lot of aspects also of medieval society, say of the Ancien Regime as such. So it was a very interesting read. Naturally, you have to think that much of the conception of the woman and her role into society, etc., was something that was during the Middle Ages and the modern era also resented much of the influence of the ancient world. So let's be honest about it. It doesn't make sense to conceive, let's be honest, the Middle Ages or the modern era are things that never existed as such. So this is this continuous cultural flow and evolution in a certain way. Naturally, it's also a matter of strictly historical problems. It's also a matter of authorities. Think about what, for instance, what Aristotle thought on women is something that had a huge importance throughout the whole, say, the low Middle Ages and the modern era, and sometimes were also very quite ugly things, not just because of sometimes also just about simply as misconceptions about not knowing, for instance, how the human body works properly, and having all these fantasy. Science at this time was already, let's say, during the modern age, we were starting to get something closer to a medical and physical knowledge overall of humans, and but before, the whole knowledge about even how the human body worked, and the organism, it was based on fantasy. in a good part. So the worst and even sometimes most stupid things were said. It goes without saying that really women were not really much considered at this time. Let's be honest about it. Surely, and we will see it today, the role of women was excruciatingly important in society. But that wasn't really very much recognized. At least, women were conceived to be fitting to those roles, and it might happen, of course, and we'll see it, that they would actually exit those roles in parts. Especially medieval society was actually much more autonomous than, say, the modern one. We should erase this pretty stupid modernistic and progressistic conception for which what comes later is better than what came before. Actually, also for the same Middle Ages, it's actually a bit debatable, in my opinion, because it's not even easy to assess historically speaking, but tendentially it seems that women, and not only women, it was at a broader level, were a social level, were generally more autonomous in the early Middle Ages than in the lower ones. It also really depends on many other factors, depending on the single society, obviously on the social role, on the extraction. Powerful people have always been more, but even in here we should conceive. I'm talking about autonomy and not of freedom, also because freedom is something also in here pretty misconceived. For most of the Middle Ages, we're talking about societies that lived in a survival rate economy. So sometimes we look at these societies that were indeed pretty grim. It gets on my nerves when people say, oh, back in the day it was so better, we were all pure, our traditions and all. It were horrible words. The average peasant lived in communities that were extremely poor, extremely ignorant, extremely abusive, and extremely violent. And it was really a hell. But at the same time, we have to understand how the process worked, because it's very easy for us to judge from our world that is not truly such a great world either, but let's say it's a bit better. At least our living conditions have remarkably improved, and to judge with our moral standards. I mean, I think that judging history through moral standards is it's feasible. I mean, I really don't find anything bad or good into it in the first place, but I wonder sometimes why it's done, because I realize that history is quite often raped for the sake of adapting certain narratives of it for today's politics. So, by the way, by making a video on gender history, I immediately know that I will be placed either in the category of immediately in the category of being either a masculist or a feminist. But I must say I don't really care about both in the first place, and I just care about history and kind of getting it right, which is already a quite very difficult thing to do by itself. And I don't know where I was getting with this, but let's say this is what I just said. Basically, it's that history has to be really understood before then judged, because the idea of freedom, this idea of freedom, for instance, of the early medieval times compared to the later ones that were. I also made some videos about the topic. I mean, how actually the Ancien Regime towards the end of the Middle Ages sort of crystallized society in a way that it became in certain ways more oppressive indeed than early medieval times. So you still have to think that early medieval times were pretty rough times, into which maybe there wasn't sort of a very strong centralized authority, so people on our age were freer, society was less stratified and all. But there were also poorer societies, so this freedom they had is pretty much theoretical, because if you have to struggle for survival, your freedom really doesn't exist. You have got because you're obliged basically to use it only in one way. And this is actually what human history has been here, even in the West, for up to the 20th century. Huh? And there are many areas of the world where you can still observe how, more or less, I don't know, not really how medieval societies were, but something comparable in terms at least of individual commitment and need of of work and survive in the first place. So I don't remember if I said this now, because I've been trying to make this intro over and over again. So I don't remember if I just said something it was before when I didn't when I stopped recording. But yeah, I think I said it, that this is gonna be a video about chiefly the communal world. So the role about working women in the communal world. So why talking about women in this context? Well, there are many good reasons for doing that in the first place. I mean, I think history is always interesting, but I think in the communal world is very, very important. First of all, you have to think that women objectively, especially from a juridical point of view, lost much of their autonomy into the communal world compared to previous societies. It's difficult to give an explanation for it, but to make it simple and approximated, let's say that when societies get more stratified, generally there are certain forces that tend to confine certain parts of the population into certain roles. So this happens all the time, telling the truth. So this happened with actually a lot of people. This was done basically every time in history by the elites that obviously always worked, were maintained on the back of their clienteles of poorer people. Also, this shouldn't be really criticized, at least this is what I don't do, historically speaking, from a classist point of view, because you realize that those societies were actually pretty functional. So even the elite and the alleged classist oppression is, it's true in part, but it was still something pretty fluid and dynamic, and let's say every class was essentially working a bit for itself. And today we will give a look chiefly to the world of the we will set this in the background of the world of the corporations. The Ancien Regime is this set of there is not really a state as such, or at least the state, if it has this thin structure, is filled with many other organisms that are we call corporations, guilds, arts, wherever you want to say that. There are these, at the time where they were called in Latin universitates, that is universities, which means that there were associations of people that were versed, therefore oriented towards a single direction. So uni versus in Latin, that's what it means. So these universities practically, and that's also where the term university comes from, because universities were born as corporations, as a matter of fact, of students and teachers. But besides this, let's say that the communal world is a moment into which the seeds of the modern state are already developing, chiefly in those regions of Europe that were more developed under this point of view, that is Italy, Flanders chiefly, but also other centers, other regions where there was the problem of really organizing society in a functional way. So these were very crowded centers. There were lots of interest. There was a lot of, actually, also of material wealth to administrate. So the communes, for instance, weren't, especially the elites, were pretty conservative in this sense, and they tried basically not to extend the corporative organization to certain sectors of society. For instance, not all craftsmen and artisans were framed into corporations. Even trade wasn't really owned completely by the corporations. Especially the urban centers were pretty much concerned into prevent the arts and crafts to put their hands on the city supplies systems, for instance, not even to transport to a certain extent, because that was actually that would have equated to control directly the same urban politics, as a matter of fact, because if you have a monopoly on the city's supplies, especially during times of famine or stuff like that, you could have disproportional political influence on the affairs of the communal, the urban society. At the same time, whereas lots of people, actually the greater masses of workers of urban centers, that were basically excluded by the corporations. And we're talking chiefly about salaried workers, and in this sense, something not at all not less important, of women. And whose importance for the society of the time has been really overlooked for a very, very long time. And for a which is not justifiable, but at least it's explainable, historically speaking, because there is a reason for it, is that official sources actually talk an extremely few about women. So this is our problem with history. We look at history through the sources, so we can't invent history without them. And therefore these categories of workers of lower status of some sort were sometimes completely even overlooked. Why was this? Well, for salaried workers and women, the reasons are a bit different. Basically, the mercantile corporations owned the to tell it say in a Marxian perspective, the so-called means of production. Okay, so these were the rich guys who had grown as merchants in the previous generations, had made a lot of money, and now had made it even to the top of the communal society. So they were basically deciding what the rights of citizens would be, and could access them. So in order to make more money, these merchants began to hire, to employ large parts of, especially of the countryside population. So these were people who normally went in the day working within the city walls and then sleeping outside. This brought, by the way, to the expansion of the same cities, to construction of other city rings, because of the suburbs of all these salaried workers that were being increasingly coming closer to settle around the city. So it's a bit like today. I mean, the human historical geography is a bit like that. There is yeah, of course, cities can develop, especially in our society, in very different ways. But generally speaking, the periphery is a place where the less people were less rich tend to live, unless it's not a very particular, quarter where people build, villas and stuff like that to get out of the center of the city because it's too chaotic and noisy, etc. But let's say that this is how things really work. As for women, instead, women didn't have, in this sense, women are not a working category. They are transversal into society. They're 50-50 in demographic terms, even more. I think there are more women than men. in the world. That I don't know about these societies. Sometimes there are very grim aspects of this too, as probably you know that the great economical problem of having a daughter was actually providing her a dowry. And this, especially among the poor people, those who didn't have a great deal to eat to survive, led to extremely sad and horrible practices like, you know, normally families slept all in a large bed, and every once in a while there was someone, some baby who died, and saying the parents said, "Oh well, she just suffocated in the dream." But telling the truth, they were killing them. This happened. This still happens in part in certain society of the world, that girls are really less wanted than boys, which is something really horrible, and this brings even to certain pretty horrible practices like this. This has been something sadly common actually in history. For these very reasons, but fortunately it wasn't all about or like that. Also because women were needed also too to make society work for evident reason, and but it was still, women were still, however, at the time, as it was said before, pretty much tied to the family, in a way that basically they couldn't freely dispose of their life. It was their fathers or whoever had a sort of patronage over her, even from a juridical point of view, because this is something that was actually pretty much important in the medieval world. I mean, the idea that a woman had a protector of some sort. This is something you find actually in the Middle Ages in perfect continuity with previous societies. Both the Romans and the Germans had these institutions. Actually, the Roman women by law were, telling you the truth, much freer, let's say in general terms, in relative terms better, to the German one. There is this thing, I don't know why people think about it, they want to say that Germanic women were extremely free, and I don't know why it's that. And there is, I think, an ideological tendency, especially from certain countries, to say, oh, okay, look at how free were women back in the day. No, they weren't. Most of the people weren't free at the time. And the fact that in the laws you find, for instance, less explicit mention of women's freedoms limitation doesn't mean that, first of all, that didn't occur into society, because laws are made to prevent something from happening. It's not a preset abstract idea of society, and then Germanic women, if they exited from their social role, they could be drawn into swamps as well. This doesn't mean, however, and this is very difficult to understand as today, that less freedom doesn't really equate to less importance. This is, I think, a very key, really a key point to understand history, because women in Germanic law were extremely guarded. They were extremely protected, safeguarded, which corresponds in turn to a tighter grip that society had on them, especially in the more primitive society. So the fact that even in the Viking era, you find women that did that looked relatively free in their activity and their life, etc. Yeah, of course there were exceptions, but generally say that we should be a bit careful at saying that they were freer than in the Roman world, because as a matter of fact, the Roman world maybe had certain more specific limitations, for instance, that we can assess, but you realize that these limitations implied at the same time a greater freedom to do something, especially in late Roman times. So actually, even in Christian times, this is also another ideological point that much is related to that. I know it's plenty of people out there who have to judge history on the base uh, of sex, of race, of religion, but social dynamics really didn't look at that very much. If you look at late Roman Empire, it seems that women were sensibly more autonomous than what they were, for instance, during the early empire, and obviously during the Republic. So we don't have to think really at freedom as and also morals were very different from today's. So now I know I got into a fix. It's a very complicated thing to pull myself out of, but I promise I will discuss that in more detail in the future. Just know that on average women weren't that free at all, and that many juridical institutes that actually remained even at this time into the low Middle Ages were part of the same early medieval ones. Talking about the worsening of women juridical conditions, for instance, during communal era, there was the matter of the dowry. Now you know that in early medieval times there was this Germanic institution for which it was usually men who paid more to marry a woman, and not the woman who had to pay with the woman's family that had to pay with her dowry. There was the so-called Morgengab, that is the gift of the day after. That would be the day after the marriage, so that the man basically presented this gift to the woman as a and that was a very you might think it's a romantic thing, but it was actually a pretty strong juridical. It was actually a legal act. If that wasn't performed, the marriage actually was not valid. So this also in here, it's complicated why this thing happened, but let's say that at a certain time in the Middle Ages, both the Morgengab and the dowry were coming together. So towards the lower Middle Ages, this thing of the Morgengab basically disappears, and everything was much more about the dowry. So the dowry that had to be obviously provided by the woman's family, and that theoretically, by law, was actually let's say a safeguarding institution for the woman, because the dowry was basically what the woman could, by law, dispose of for herself. Now, what instead starts happening, especially in these very advanced societies of the low Middle Ages, is that the dowry is basically taken by the husband and disposed by the husband at will. And there were lots, believe me, lots of legal, let's say, of trials, of problems, etc., related to this. And this is pretty interesting because it shows you from one side that the law, I mean, the existing laws were quite good. I mean, of course, not for our standards, because certain laws were pretty bad. Also in terms of what, obviously men and women didn't have equal rights at the time. Men were much more favored. But at the same time, it was a so this makes the picture even darker, because even the few rights that women actually have, such as managing autonomously their dowry, were often usurped in a certain fashion. This said, however, not everything was so dark and oppressive. I mean, women, especially in these more advanced societies, it's a bit like the example I was making with Roman society, that maybe certain aspects of these laws make us think at the first read that this made women more controlled socially, etc. But at the same time, you realize that social control actually came from the fact that women had a larger degree of autonomy. So this is not something immediately evident, but if you really cross-sect all the sources we have, all the evidence, you realize that women had actually pretty decent autonomy, especially in terms of working. Today we're talking about this, in terms of work. And there are certain very impressive studies about this. At a certain point, where certain corporations made up, even this towards the very late Middle Ages, and especially in very wealthy places like the Flanders, and there were corporations that had enormous numbers of women, almost all of women. This was an exception, of course, but by digging into the archives, we actually we're seeing much more of these situations coming to light. We have, I think, gender studies are important in this sense um, because they really have been too overlooked. That's a side of history that has still partly to be rewritten. So this doesn't mean that will be turned upside down. uh, the reality what was the one we practically already know. But in terms of especially of working women, I repeat it, there is an evidence of a very large autonomy of the woman in some ways. So how we can go on in this? So okay, coming back to the corporations, it's obvious that men had a greater dynamism, a greater freedom, a greater employment in the top roles, um, because that was part of what the business was. I mean, the same dynamics that saw men, the husbands acquiring, for instance, the women's dowry, um, was the same one for which men were progressively pushing women also from out of certain activities during this period, and being the only ones who actually managed the family capitals, etc. But there is also great evidence, as we were saying, of a much greater importance of women that it was previously thought in environments that are actually very different from the very diverse from just the domestic one. And that was acquiring an increasingly greater importance in these centuries of the urban rebirth and of the ensuing economical development, into which especially the various employments were becoming increasingly diversified and numerous, in generally speaking. So even the working opportunities implied different arts, different skills, etc. So, as for instance, in the early Middle Ages, as we've seen, most of the people were just, it was just one work. It was the agriculture. Well, still at this time, um, the average medieval person was a peasant indeed. But into the city, we can see a lot more. Also because the cities produced sources, more iconographic evidence, documents, and all. So we are simply better documented about those societies. But also about the rural world to a certain extent. So, first of all, women have always had this great, carrying out a family is something pretty difficult to do, pretty demanding, pretty tough. At the same time, you notice that these women were able to handle both, in this sense, their families and their works at the same time. And there is, in certain sense, this is obvious for those time standards. I mean, we would be probably surprised on how frequent that really was, everywhere, at every time in history in some measure. For instance, the family unity, for instance, overlapped quite often, corresponded to the entrepreneurial one. This is pretty much obvious. I mean, think at how many think about shops, taverns, hotels. Especially towards the late Middle Ages, we see actually extremely wealthy and powerful women who had what we could really think of chains of hotels, of taverns that they managed, that they ruled on their own. This is very important. This also, you have, now I don't want to make the video too long, but there are so many implications in this. Even the, for instance, the age of marriage or the decision to marry or not was something that varied extensively in history. If you think of those economical cycles of famines, then agricultural surplus, etc., those made actually the marriage age, both for men and women, oscillating, swinging really a lot, even in the range of a few generations. So even the decision of usually women at this time were married when they were pretty young, because this was the point, that the men usually married, because this is not when they were already well, they already had a job, an activity that could give them the means to sustain a family. So we're usually much older than women as well. I think much of what I've seen of this age is that, men married in their 30s, marrying essentially girls, teen girls. Even women could get married even at, usually got married at 14, but even earlier actually. There are many examples also of naturally in the upper echelons of society of great interests in terms of marrying that girl because maybe she was the heiress of a certain family. So it was, the sooner you married her, the worry, the greater the security of seizing that, let's say, those profits was. And so naturally marriage at this time was rarely a matter of love, of feeling, of sentiments, but it corresponded rather to this strictly, it was a contract, and still is a contract, by the way, corresponded to mostly economical interests. And at those times, sometimes we look at that as if saying, oh wow, it must have been grim. Well, yes, but it wasn't really the worst thing that could happen to you in those times. It was bad if indeed certain girls didn't want to marry, which is actually showed pretty extensively, and this is a very sad part of the story, telling a very dramatic one. Especially women who didn't women at this time were taught, obviously, also to be extremely religious. You have to think of the very sharp contrast that existed even a few times ago between this extremely religious background, that was what young girls and also young men, but as we've seen, girls married very early, all knew about. So this very chaste and decent world of chiefly spiritual feelings that looked at bodily desires as as a sin, essentially, and then being at 12 or 13 to abandon your home as a girl and to be married to a man of, I don't know, 35 years old, and having this insistent and almost obsessive need of making children, so a lot of sex involved. There is not many other ways, and how that was jarring, and how that could be traumatically, how much it could be really traumatic at that point for these young girls. So we see that even histories of violence, of abuse, of very sad stories that unfortunately are not anything new in our societies as well, but at that time were kind of maybe not so habitual as we might picture us in the worst way, but they were at least something extremely difficult to first to 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 denounce, for instance. It was very few things you could really do about it. So this was a world into which you have to think even of the psychological minds of these people to be extremely altered in some measure. Living in those times was not easy for anyone by any standards. And just think about something so personal, so intimate, like a relation and having children really could come from. So it is marrying to a foreigner who is 20 years older than you, and well, that's pretty grim. And there are even other stricter details that I won't discuss now, but it could be really a very traumatic experience. But let's say, aside from this tragic element, let's say that not all marriages were definitely dramas or something traumatic, and actually marrying was a great goal for a woman at the time, because that meant to have a future, to have the possibility of having your own house, to have children, to have a certain degree of autonomy. You have to think that many girls at this time were sent to monasteries, to religious institutions, to become nuns, for instance. That was also another very, there is also beautiful literature about this, even in more recent times, to which these girls actually didn't want to go to become nuns, and some were. It was also these spiritual tendencies. For instance, many girls didn't want to marry. They didn't want that. They felt that they wanted to be closer to God, to have this spiritual life, etc. But most of them, generally speaking, wouldn't. And that also was a pretty sad, episode. And many girls were sent to be nuns, in fact, for their families not to pay dowries for them. So this was something pretty, also another very sad part of their life, because it's as if your parents basically wanted to exclude you, to give eventually the dowry maybe to your older sister, to another sister that in this sense could have had more resources to dispose when she would have become a wife, etc. So yeah, it was really it really sucked in many ways. But at the same time, women who got married were fairly happy. And what we realized that sometimes these marriages were pretty solid affairs. Maybe there wasn't love, but there was friendship and respect, and it was something seen as socially good, socially right, righteous, and the woman as a wife had her own spaces, her own autonomy, as well, as we will see. So in the case of, let's say, of this entrepreneurial activity that, as we've seen, shops, taverns, hostels, etc., women could have a very large degree of autonomy and power. There are many great historical figures in this sense that had of women that had also a great entrepreneurial instinct, who were actually pretty successful business women. And the idea is that naturally these were also activities that were passed from generation to generation, because this is eventually how the ancien regime was eventually formed. I mean, usually social mobility was a bit crystallized, so the children would have to become the job of their parents, and they were grown in same houses to learn the craft in this sense. So for I think anyone who has an idea of what a medieval life could really be into a city, usually there were these houses with the ground floor with the shop, and essentially the apartments of the family who ran the shop just even inside in some other rooms or upstairs. So that was life and work together. It was a pretty convenient thing to do. Still today, you can see some examples of that. Um, Another great activity was reserved. Great activity in the sense that it was something extremely widespread, and in fact, in these pictures I'm putting on the background that recurs extremely frequently was the activity of textile manufacture. This is something also that started into the Middle Ages or existed before and kept existing for a very long time, up to a very few time ago. That is essentially that women were working they were weaving, so spinning wool and other fibers, and this was not just a family business. It was actually, and especially in this communal world, from this time in the communal world, a greater part of a greater industry. Salaried workers were usually men, so those, but not only. We will see that later. But women, that say women were. I Before I stressed the fact that they had a larger autonomy. They were often employed also where you wouldn't expect them to be employed, to do also very very tough jobs, physically speaking. So, but generally speaking, women would still be mostly living at home, and there was also a lot of cultural and moral pressure in this sense for happening. The greatest problem of any at that time was evidently the fact that if a woman would have got pregnant with someone who was not her husband, this would have messed up the legal situation because of the claiming the various right. It was something outrageous. It was not done. It was not, and this was something that was happening culturally, morally, also for certain, not just for pure matters of feelings. Because, for instance, men usually had lovers, and frequenting prostitutes was something extremely normal at the time. But the matter of women was this fact of the matter of the descendant. So whose son that children whose children that is that was the big problem also from a legal point of view. That's why the greatest insult that existed for men is to be a cuckolded, essentially, and for a woman to be a prostitute, because that was the main infamy that could happen to a family in those times, and we're still living on the wake of that, even if obviously today there are more strictly and rightful sentimental reasons for that. But at the time it was a very very serious business, chiefly from a legal and consequently from an economical point of view. And there were naturally many tragedies attached to this. So relatively to the textile manufacturing, what happened is that these big communal centers were usually specializing into this textile production and exports. So sometimes even luxury products, something that was for the international market and that was deriving as resources basically from the surplus that the city could draw from the surrounding countryside. So that's how these activities were there. Think about Italy, think about Flanders. Those were centers who made their fortune in part through that activity. And women, so this huge amount of the society was engaged into some form of textile manufacturing at home, spinning, as we've said, spinning wool and other materials and weaving, etc. And this could be from, say, a small activity of individual activity to something greater. So certain families who also maybe had other businesses, maybe were in part having a parallel business by weaving. And women were pretty much involved into this. So women of every age, you have to think that this started from a very early age. This was a world in which, in spite of the wealth of, the relative wealth of the communal society, was still a poor world. So for having a solid income, you had really to work very, very hard. The so even learning how the craft from an early age was very important, and these were evidently this was evidently a knowledge that was handed down generation by generation, like a bit old crafts at that time. So but as we were saying, women also worked out of their home, outdoors. So the this obviously was usually at benefit of the family. So that women had always this tutelage in a certain sense, and this happened as well for widows and unmarried women as well, both to survive for themselves, but also to help eventually their children, and to have also sort of dynamism on their own. You can imagine that even for the psychological problems that we talked about before, that there had to be a sort of even of psychological redemption. Women in this sense waited. I mean, I know it sounds bad, but some women waited, or at least it was normal. It was considered normal for the life expectancy of the time, that sooner or later the woman would have remained a widow. We have seen that usually the age difference between husband and son was pretty high. So people didn't live a big much at the time. So it was perfectly plausible, even for a girl in her mid-20s. To become widow, and being in your mid-20s at the time meant to be already sort of mature person. People aged much faster at the time than today. There's also another thing that has to be considered. I mean, at 30 years old, at 35, especially at 40, you were considered an old person. And you were done essentially. So and you would the life expectancy was critical, especially in the first years of age. But if you surpass your adolescence, if you made it through your adolescence, you had good chances to arrive into 60, 70. I mean, it wasn't, but obviously dying earlier was also much more frequent than today. Hygiene was what it was. Wars, epidemics, it wasn't an easy life. So also great part of this emphasis put on creating a family and making children, to do everything quick, essentially in a biological timing perspective, was something also related to these greater pressure of external factors that really were pretty heavy burden over pretty heavy pressure over society at the time. And also because if people died before having made children, I mean those money would have gone to someone else. So there was this tendency of trying to keep even your wealth into a single line, a single family line. It was important. By the way, relatively to this, there were also a lot of donations. Women were renownedly always very close to these charity activities, and this is not really something that starts with Christianity. It was part of, generally speaking, what the role of women was in ancient societies. Women were, while men went out to war and doing essentially that, women were often in charge. This is also another overlooked fact, that women often were in charge of the home, because men traveled a lot. Either they went to war or they were traders. So there had to be someone who took care of the business. Obviously, men were always there in some fashion. These, you have to think of medieval families were something much more like a clan rather than the individual family nucleus as we conceive it today. There was a lot of living together of many people, so this worked like a sort of corporation on its own. In fact, in corporative theories, this was done. I mean, the family was the base of the state at the time. Think about Baudin, that is actually writing this. So it's a very different world from our own in this sense. But however, women were left often in charge of affairs, of administration, organization, etc. And this also implied relations with other people, with institutions, often religious institutions. And there were even these, orders that weren't really monastic orders, but they were a bit a half and a half, kind of helping to the religious community, to the ecclesiastical community, but being still free to go live in your house. And this was pretty spread. I mean, it was a pretty habitual activity that was done at the time, especially for widows, and to keep up active in a certain measure, and to care also about their afterlife. These were also pretty important concerns for those times. Women were involved in a wide variety of activities. For instance, in the sale of foodstuffs, for instance, bread, fruit, vegetables, etc. Working into these even crowded places in markets, and other women were instead working as nurses, nannies, or midwives, or simply domestic servants as well. At this time, serfdom existed, so that was also a profitable job. By the way, serfs were usually, was trying to use women for female serfs for women. That was usually done also for the concerns about the paternity that we were mentioning before. There were many affairs between masters and serfs at the time, of both sexes. Naturally, it was usually, actually, this is also a pretty sad story as well, because female serfs were quite often abused by the masters, and sometimes the children were raised into the same house. So sometimes this wasn't even something happening. I mean, maybe the two, the master and the serf fell in love, but naturally, maybe for the wife, this would have not been so nice after all. But there are many examples actually of illegitimate sons and daughters that were raised eventually as such, and being family in practice, even if legally speaking that was another matter. The midwives were also very important. Midwives, you have to think of midwives at this point were extremely more skilled than doctors in carrying out baby deliveries, let's say, and this also is a very sad part of the story, because there were many negative stereotypes attached to women, especially noblemen didn't want their children to be born through the help of midwives, because it was considered that, yeah, as if the midwife could, as a being a woman, so it's a very dark thing, could have, I don't know, given the newborn baby a negative influence and stuff like that. And instead, these midwives were very, very skilled, because medicine at this time, the so-called doctors at this time, were very rarely actually having a concrete material medical experience. Doctors at these times were the ones who studied from the books of the ancient authors, and got interested in very theoretical and abstract affairs. Surgeons were often barbers instead, and in fact nurses were these midwives and all that, had instead a great practical knowledge that doctors didn't have, and that quite often saved the life of people, in this case the midwives of many women and children, that doctors instead wouldn't, because they had completely no experience, and they did very very silly things most of the times. Even for any medical matter, seemingly every matter was solved with, at least this is what they show in movies, phlebotomy, that is bloodletting. That was seemingly the most preferred thing. But these women with practice instead were extremely more skilled in the in how to actually carry out and to help women in their delivery, and really having a lot of experience and eye for important aspects that doctors were not aware of. And still, instead, such women, in fact, what you see is that the elites had this kind of posh attitude. They didn't want the future male child to be born by a midwife, because that was considered an infamy. But if you look at the lower strata of the population, you realize that it was much more a much more positive attitude towards midwives in this sense, and those stereotypes, those sexist stereotypes of the women to be inferior substantially, was out there because the science of that time believed so, weren't there. So even, you understand, I believe that the spontaneity of human relations actually brings to such tolerance in actual fact, and that it's mostly the elites of people who have great interests that like to boast these kind of ideologies that in this sense were also pretty disturbing for our mental standards. But what is also very interesting is that it happened to find women in situations and employments that I think today, for most people, would not be very easily predictable. For instance, on construction sites, where, by the way, women were used for all the heaviest operations. Think about the transport of water, stones, and lime, etc. And we are actually particularly fortunate to have an extensive iconographic evidence of this, because otherwise we don't know it from other documents. And we know instead that women were used also for such heavy jobs, and this eventually shows you that they were, there was a great need of working, that, works at jobs at the time were something pretty harsh, and women went out there just to earn something for their families and themselves, so even breaking their backs in the process. At the time there weren't many concerns for the workers' health and rights, etc., especially of serfs, etc. So and you have to think of and the female presence in there is very, very interesting in my opinion. There is also a set evidence relatively to the pays of women that was usually half the one of men at the time. So as you understand, I'm now generalizing for the whole low Middle Ages, but this is pretty much the average evidence that we have. So this might have happened, I don't know, even maybe because women may have worked, might have actually done less in some circumstances. I don't really know because I don't know the sources. But I know by fact that for the same jobs in so the same exact effort, women were paid less. So this is also pretty sadly eloquent about the society of the time. Passing a little bit to the agricultural world, that is also very, the average medieval person this time was a peasant. So this is evidently important. So also in here, women had the same engagement in the agricultural works than you can imagine, which do not really imply just staying out in the field, but also taking care about the house and a lot of things. And then now we will see. So women participated to the harvest, to cereal husking, harvest and grape harvest, the flaking of flax and hemp, collection of olives, chestnuts, and other different fruits, the cultivation of vegetable gardens. It was the women, sometimes even girls, who were entrusted the care of the flocks and herds, and as well as the care of the low court animals, such as poultry, rabbits, pigs, etc. So even in the countryside, the spinning weaving was practiced, especially spinning, and it was mostly also associated with animal guarding. So it's kind of it. You have to imagine these women in their farms, saving time essentially by spinning and keeping an eye on the animals. Something you can do at the same time. So a very important role was of women was emerging, especially starting from the half of the 13th century, especially into central Italy, where potteral sharecropping was spreading. I made a video on the medieval sharecropping, actually a pair, I think. If you want to give you the name. Yeah, there are two videos. One is called The Origins of Sharecropping in the 13th, 14th century Italian communes, and the other is Tuscan sharecropping and European landholding in the late Middle Ages. So you can give a look at what it is in a broader perspective. What is important here is that women had a great role in this form of land exploitation system, and so it was basically the task of a farmer's wife. So essentially the housewife that disposed of the head of the family. Whose task was extremely was really not less essential compared to the one of her husband, and having to be charged with the coordination of the work, also of other women, part of the family, that is daughters, nieces, and daughters-in-laws, and etc. And which you have to add up to the already to the daily needs of an extended family. So the work that came from managing all things at once for these women. And so this is, for instance, one of sharecropping is a very important um, a very important part of history, because it's a lifestyle, it's a form of social organization, that a socio-economical organization that remained even up to the 20th century, even up to the 50s, the 60s of the 20th century. So, and women had a great importance in there. For instance, you often hear that in Italy there is this kind of matriarchal impact. Telling the truth, from an anthropological point of view, it's mistaken, because the matriarchy is, first of all, something very rare in human societies, and in Europe there is basically never been any historical evidence of that at any time. This is often exchanged for matriarchy, but actually derives from this sharecropping that was extremely widespread into Italy, and into which women, in this sense, were culturally entrusted this role of this cooperative management of the farm. So there were these Italian women were in charge of these affairs. And it was normal in their society, so that they had more decisional autonomy and a greater, they were involved into business, etc. So there are many things I would like to add, but I would like to be the video not to be extremely long as usual, unfortunately. But I mean, it's plenty of evidence of extremely important roles that women covered into. Let's leave aside royalty, because people are obsessed by royalty. I know that, yeah, especially there is attention for costumes. It's cool and all. And it's like a beautiful dream in this people. But let's look at the everyday person, not just royalty. Of course, royalty and other noble women were sometimes extremely important, historically speaking. Think about, I don't know, Isabella of Castile, Isabella d'Este, or Caterina Sforza. There are many great women in history who were extremely great leaders, even, with an extreme risk, because even at the time we have this stupid idea that the elites were, yeah, they were privileged, but they were privileged up to one point, but they were constantly involved into, their life was not just banqueting and playing, lutes and taking walks around picking flowers. These people were involved in extremely serious affairs, political and military affairs, that could wipe them out from a moment to another. So even this romantic idea of the Middle Ages that was formed in the 19th century actually sucks, and I find disgusting that great interest in the Middle Ages actually comes from such romantic fantasies. But just for saying that, even in the average, the average person, the average population, women had very important roles. There is evidence, for instance, of women, of teachers, of women among teachers. This is a very important thing. There is, I think, one of the pictures that skipped before. It's a woman teaching Euclides to, I don't know where that is from. Whether it was on university, I don't know. To men. This is very interesting. Women had a great role also, and a great awareness of their status and of their rights. There is evidence, this perhaps was from the 16th century, so we are already in the modern age, but there was a woman, a widow, in, I think it was either, I don't know whether in the region of Rome or in Tuscany, but was so she had remained widowed, and she had inherited her husband's property of certain mines of alum. of alum, and or if I remember correctly, and basically there were other businessmen who basically wanted to extremate her from the affairs, and to seize and to expel her, to exclude her from this, and to throw her out and seize these mines. And this woman was extremely determined, extremely straightforward. She knew, no, I want, and she didn't give up, and she appealed to the tribunals, and she made it to keep the property of those mines. So here you have to think of a world where there were many private interests and corruption, and also even as a woman that was already juridically less considerate, to take a stand and to claim her rights, and to make it true in a society like that. Justice wasn't much there around. You have to reason as a sort of continuous mafia being out there in the ancien regime, in every society, basically, with people who had their business behind the statal power, something like that. So it wasn't not an easy world to live in, and you find these women that were supposedly always in the pretty naive and prejudiced conception of history, are always closing their homes and thinking about nothing, and being left ignorant and purpose, that were instead extremely active and dynamic and aware, and therefore educated. This is also a very overlooked side of the story. Let's say the fact that women didn't study. Yeah, well, this is true on average. Obviously, the wealthiest women, the women from the upper class, usually were more educated. But this also really has to do with what education was conceived for at the time. I mean, men studied to exercise a profession, which is, it sounds banal to say, because also today that's how white people study, and get educated. But let's say that certain educations were so strictly, there wasn't much time left to, let's say, pure pleasure of reading and of learning. These were certain careers that required a lot of commitment, and that were quite busy lives. Sometimes women did read, in this sense, with more interest, with more chance to actually get interested in something they liked, and there are countless examples, even of female relatives of many great, for instance, scientists, or for instance Galileo in the now, we are in still in the modern age, but for instance, we have an epistolary between him and his daughter, and you realize that even if this daughter, I don't remember now the story, but I don't think she was she had an employment but she actually studied what her father wrote, and she understood that. She knew about astronomy, and so you understand that sometimes it is true that women were prevented from taking certain careers. We were kind of segregated in many ways. We were prevented from having an autonomous life, but they still understood a lot. They were pretty aware of their role as well, in this sense. So sometimes I like to explain history in a bit of a deterministic way, by saying that, oh well, those were the times, so people kind of got used to that. It's what I said before a little bit, but we don't have to think that these people were autonomous. They obviously realized what society was about and what was doing to them, so they might have got used to that, but they still were aware that there were possibilities outside of those social limitations, and they reacted to it. So it's I don't know what are examples I could make, but I will surely come back on history of women, especially during the Middle Ages, which I find extremely fascinating. As I could get a little bit more into the topic more than else, because otherwise it's just me rambling about things that that I don't know and speculating. But I like to make this video, and I realized that, yeah. I realized from my stats that I'm not extremely engaging, apparently, because I don't put a lot of animation. I don't put a lot of effort in graphics and all, and also my English sucks, etc. But if I got you a bit interested in this topic, I think I'm happy about it, because that's a part of history that is overlooked and also misunderstood, in my opinion. Because see, a lot of people also who get into these gender studies, they don't really do it for the sake of historical truth and really thinking about what it was for these women to live at the time. They just like certain custom, say, maybe they're more interested in the history of customs, of fashions, etc., etc. But I personally love really the psychological side. I like really to try to imagine what it could be to live in those times, and how these humans would really react, because I care about the perspective. I care about the individual's perspective. I care about the individual accomplishments, and I find extraordinary in this sense that that in societies where objectively was not easy to be a woman, or at least it's never easy either to be a man or a woman. Even today, I believe, it's not easy to be humans, as a matter of fact. But in a world into which indeed the woman was considered inferior, so it started objectively from a lower position. It had less rights. It was prevented to do certain things. It had less freedom, etc. I find all the more remarkable to show to look at these female individuals who managed to break that barrier and come out and really make a solid stand. And it's unfortunate that we don't know much about the else, because both of strictly historical problems, because we don't know a big deal about even those times societies under many point of view, even for men, obviously. But this extra thing, I mean, about the female perspective, it's according to me very important, and consider that women, in as always in history, have always had to both work and take care of the family, whereas actually, as we've seen today, also pretty much there were two intermingling activities, but it's a pretty serious thing. Think about these women. This is something I didn't point at, but these were making children continuously. At the time, there was such a high children's mortality that the best and people lived short, that they were continuously having children. So you have to think of these women. By the way, childbirth could lead quite easily to the death of the woman as well as of the child. So it was a continuously these people wouldn't know really how long they would have lived, even for such a beautiful thing like giving birth. This could often turn into a tragedy and the end of someone's life, so of the woman's life and the child's life. So this was a world into which really, if you don't have solid nerves, it's really hard to deal, and people lived like that, and they made it after all, and they arrived to us. we come from them, and therefore I'm very sensitive to the memory of these people, because yeah, they might have lived in a world that was really bad, and that they might have held terrible conceptions. They might have been criminals and violent, and etc. But it's still the reason. They are still the reason why we exist the way we do. So I think that in a way or another, we have to think about these people, and especially thinking of these very structural factors, like the fact, of course, that childbirth could be mortal, could be deadly. Well, that is something bad, really, and still, that's how they worked, and if you want to understand those times, you have to look at these things, because you can understand so much through them. You can understand so much about that society, and society is moved by people who have a certain mindset, who have certain beliefs, who have certain emotions, and it's really important to understand those, to understand a historical period. And the more, by the way, the more I learn about history, the more I have respect for people who lived back in the day, because I realize that given that we are the same exact animals, I personally wouldn't, it would have been extremely tough to live in those moments, even only from, let's leave aside the physical efforts and the sufferings, etc., but just from a psychological point of view. Yeah, sure, there were probably also messed up people, psychologically speaking. I don't doubt about this, and that's why probably also the morals resented of such. Why do you wonder why that world was so abusive in many ways? Well, also because there was perpetrating those abuses through the same structural factors that informed society. Think when you were a kid, to see, I don't know, your mother giving birth continuously, and seeing like 1/3 of your siblings to die in their cradle. I mean, that is something horrible. From a think about the even the promiscuity sometimes, or the hygiene, or how society was violent at the time. Now today we talk about the communal world. The communal world really was a pretty messed up. It was a lot of violence, and a lot of wars. There was a violence that was part of everyday life, in a certain sense, or at least that people were used to in a certain fashion. Political, military clashes were out there in the streets every day. So you can think about coming out psychologically shaped by certain events, and so it's really, really tough. So okay, as I was saying, I will definitely I will make other videos on medieval women, and for now I just hope that you enjoyed this one, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.